My aunt demands I hand over my inheritance because she's the family matriarch after she disowned me at 16. When the estate attorney read my grandmother's will out loud and my aunt's face went white, I almost laughed, because for 1 second I thought the shock on her face meant she was happy for me. It didn't. It meant she'd expected her own name to be in that paragraph, not mine. My grandmother had left me the house, the savings, and every dollar of a life she'd spent 71 years building, and she'd left her own daughter nothing but a single sentence that said Delphine already received her inheritance the day she put my 16-year-old niece out on the street. I watched my aunt's hands curl into fists on the conference table, and I knew right then that the real fight hadn't even started yet. I'd been living a quiet, unremarkable life for the 6 years since my grandmother took me in. I worked as a structural drafter for a civil engineering firm downtown, the kind of job where nobody asks you personal questions because everyone's too busy staring at blueprints. I paid my rent on time, I kept a small savings account, and I visited my grandmother, Eleanor Merrick, every Sunday for pot roast and reruns of whatever detective show she was obsessed with that month. She was the only person in my family who never once made me feel like a burden. My mother, Vivian, died in a car accident when I was 14, and after that, my Aunt Delphine became my legal guardian, mostly because nobody else volunteered. Delphine was my mother's older sister by 9 years, and she ran her house the way she ran everything else in her life, like a corporation with herself as CEO. She had a husband named Roland, who mostly stayed quiet, and a son named Preston, who was 2 years older than me and treated our shared house like a hotel he tolerated. From the moment I moved in, Delphine made it clear that I was a guest who needed to earn her keep, not a grieving kid who'd just lost her mother. She called herself the head of the family, the one who held everyone together, and she said it so often that I started to believe maybe that was true. Maybe I really did owe her something just for letting me exist under her roof. The rules started small and grew fast. Curfew at 7, even on weekends. No friends over without 48 hours notice. A weekly chore chart that read more like a lease agreement than a family calendar. When my mother's small life insurance payout came through, $12,000 meant to help raise me, Delphine put it in an account she said was for the family, and I never saw a cent of it spent on me directly. I told myself it was fine, that this was just how grief worked in adult households, that maybe I was imagining the coldness. But at night I'd lie awake doing math in my head, trying to figure out where that money had actually gone, and the numbers never once pointed toward me. The first real crack came when I was 15 and a half. I found a receipt in the kitchen trash for a family vacation to a resort in another state. Dated the same month, Delphine told me the insurance money was all gone on my school expenses. I hadn't gone on any vacation. Preston had posted photos online of a beach I'd never seen, tagged with Delphine and Roland smiling in matching sunglasses. My stomach dropped reading the caption, something about a well-deserved family getaway. I didn't say anything at first, because confronting Delphine felt like poking a hornet's nest with my bare hand, and I'd learned by then that questioning her authority never ended well for anyone but her. I brought it up anyway, quietly, at dinner one night, asking where the trip money had come from if my school fund was empty. Delphine's face didn't even flinch. She said family money was family money, that everything she spent benefited the household I lived in, and that I should be grateful she hadn't sent me to foster care instead. Roland stared at his plate. Preston smirked into his glass of water. I remember my hands shaking under the table, not from fear exactly, but from the specific, cold realization that the woman raising me had already decided I wasn't really hers to protect, only hers to manage. 6 months later, right after I turned 16, everything fell apart in a single weekend. I'd started dating a boy from my chemistry class named Elias. Nothing serious, just movie nights and library study sessions. But Delphine found a text thread on my phone and decided I was, in her words, becoming a distraction to the household. She called an emergency family meeting in the living room, the kind where Roland sat silent and Preston filmed part of it on his phone like it was entertainment. Delphine told me I'd shown her exactly who I really was, ungrateful and reckless, just like my mother had been before she ran off and got herself killed. A sentence that still sits in my chest like a stone I never managed to swallow all the way down. She told me I had until the end of the month to find somewhere else to live. I was 16 years old with no job, no license, and no idea what emancipation even meant legally. I remember asking her, my voice cracking, what she expected me to do, and she said that was exactly the kind of question that proved I was too much trouble to keep around. She said the family had given me enough already, that she wasn't running a charity, that maybe living with consequences would finally teach me some respect. I packed 2 duffel bags of clothes and left the insurance money question unanswered forever, because by then I understood I was never getting a straight answer, only more reasons why everything was somehow my fault. My grandmother took me in that same week without asking a single question beyond whether I liked pot roast. Eleanor Merrick was 71 years old at the time, a retired schoolteacher who'd buried a husband and a daughter and somehow still had room in her small house for a scared 16-year-old granddaughter. She never once made me feel like a burden, never charged me rent, never brought up Delphine unless I did first. She helped me get my license, sat with me through a year of night classes to catch up on missed credit hours, and cheered louder than anyone at my community college graduation 5 years later. She used to say that family wasn't the people who share your blood, it was the people who show up with a spare bedroom and no conditions attached, and I believed her completely, because she'd proven it to me every single day since I was 16. For 6 years, my relationship with Delphine existed only at arm's length, a few strained holidays where we exchanged polite nothing sentences and avoided eye contact. Preston occasionally messaged me on social media with vague, guilt-laden comments about how Grandma Eleanor was getting older and shouldn't we all be closer as a family. I ignored most of it. I built a life that had nothing to do with the Ashworth household. A steady drafting job, a small rented apartment, a handful of close friends who knew the broad strokes of my story but never pried for details. I thought that chapter of my life was closed, sealed, done. I was wrong, but I didn't find that out until the phone call that came on a rainy afternoon in early spring, the one that started with my grandmother's neighbor asking if I could come to the hospital right away. Eleanor had suffered a massive stroke while gardening in her backyard, the same rose bushes she'd tended every spring for as long as I could remember. I drove to the hospital so fast I don't remember most of the trip, just the fluorescent lights of the ICU waiting room and a doctor named Priya Anand explaining, in careful measured sentences, that the damage was severe and the next 48 hours would tell us everything. I sat beside my grandmother's bed holding her hand, listening to machines breathe for her, and I made a quiet promise that whatever happened, I would take care of everything she'd ever cared about. I didn't know yet how literally that promise would be tested. Eleanor passed away 4 days later, peacefully, with me holding one hand and her longtime neighbor, Mrs. Odell, holding the other. Delphine showed up at the hospital only once, for maybe 20 minutes, dressed like she was attending a business meeting rather than saying goodbye to her mother. She cried the appropriate amount, hugged me stiffly in the hallway, and left before the doctors even finished explaining the final details. I remember thinking, even through my own grief, that something about her urgency felt off, like she was already mentally somewhere else, already calculating something I couldn't quite see yet. I didn't understand what that something was until the will reading 2 weeks later. The reading took place in a modest downtown office belonging to Roberta Quinn, an estate attorney with 22 years of experience, who'd handled my grandmother's affairs for the better part of a decade. Delphine arrived 10 minutes late wearing a black dress clearly bought for the occasion, Roland trailing behind her like a shadow, Preston scrolling his phone the entire time. I sat alone on the opposite side of the small conference table, my hands folded in my lap, trying to steady my breathing. Roberta opened the folder, adjusted her glasses, and began reading in the calm, practiced voice of someone who'd delivered this kind of news 1,000 times before, though nothing about that afternoon felt routine to me. The will was direct in a way that surprised even me. Eleanor left the house, free and clear of any mortgage, along with her entire savings and investment accounts, roughly $680,000 combined, to me alone. There was a short paragraph specifically addressing Delphine, stating that she had already received her share of the family's support and resources over the years, and that any further distribution was neither necessary nor intended. Roberta read that sentence slowly, glancing up once as if to make sure everyone in the room understood exactly what it meant. Delphine's face drained of color, then flushed red, and I watched her jaw tighten the exact same way it used to when I was 16 and about to be told I'd disappointed the family again. She didn't explode right there in the attorney's office, not yet. She sat very still, her fingers pressed flat against the table, and asked Roberta in a tight, controlled voice whether the will could be contested. Roberta explained, professionally and without a hint of judgment, that the document was notarized, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and drafted 18 months prior with Eleanor demonstrating full mental competency at the time of signing. Delphine asked the question 3 different ways, phrasing it slightly differently each time, as though she expected a different answer if she just found the right combination of words. Roberta gave her the same calm, unmovable response every time, and I could see something behind my aunt's eyes shifting from disbelief into something colder and far more determined. We left the office separately, without speaking, and I assumed that would be the end of it, a bitter final chapter closing on a relationship that had already been broken for 6 years. I was wrong within 72 hours. My phone rang on a Wednesday evening while I was unpacking groceries, and Delphine's name lit up the screen for the first time in longer than I could remember. I almost didn't answer, but some old instinct, some leftover habit of obedience from being 16 and terrified of her, made my thumb swipe accept before I fully decided to. Her voice came through warm and reasonable, nothing like the woman who'd stormed out of Roberta's office days earlier, and that shift alone should have told me exactly what kind of conversation I was about to have. She said she wanted to meet for lunch, just the 2 of us, to talk things through like family. She said the will had come as a shock, that grief made people say and do things they didn't mean, and that surely we could find a fair way to honor Grandma Eleanor's memory together. I told myself, against every instinct screaming otherwise, that maybe this was genuine. Maybe 6 years and a mother's death had actually changed something in her. Some small, exhausted part of me still wanted a family that functioned the way other people's families seemed to, and that wanting was enough to get me into my car 2 days later, driving toward a restaurant Delphine had chosen near her house, the same kind of quiet trap I should have recognized from a mile away. She was already seated when I arrived, a cup of coffee steaming in front of her, her expression arranged into something that almost passed for warmth. She complimented my job, asked about my apartment, made small talk about Preston's new marketing position, all the surface-level pleasantries of people who share blood but not intimacy. I let her talk, waiting for the shift I already sensed coming, and it arrived exactly the way I expected it to, sliding in sideways between sentences about the weather and her garden. She said that as the eldest child, as the true matriarch of the family now that Grandma Eleanor was gone, she believed the estate should be distributed according to family tradition, not according to a piece of paper written when Eleanor was, in her words, emotionally vulnerable. I asked her directly what number she had in mind, because I already understood there was always a number with Delphine. There always had been. She said $200,000 would be a fair starting point, enough to help stabilize Roland's struggling contracting business and set Preston up with a down payment on a house. She said it so casually, like she was requesting a loan for something mundane, like she hadn't kicked a 16-year-old girl out onto the street 6 years earlier without a second thought. I reminded her, as steadily as I could manage, that she'd told me back then I needed to learn to live with consequences, and I asked whether that lesson didn't apply to her too now that the consequence in question was a will she didn't like. Her expression hardened instantly, the warmth evaporating like it had never existed at all. She said I was twisting the past to justify being selfish, that raising a teenager cost money she was owed reimbursement for, that family obligations didn't expire just because feelings got hurt along the way. I told her I wasn't giving her a single dollar of my grandmother's estate, and I watched her hands tighten around her coffee cup hard enough that I genuinely thought it might crack in her grip. She leaned forward and said, in a low, controlled voice that somehow scared me more than yelling would have, that I had 1 week to reconsider before she made this situation very difficult for me. Then she stood, left a $5 bill on the table, and walked out without looking back. I sat there for a long moment afterward, my pulse hammering in my ears, replaying every word she'd said until my hands finally stopped trembling enough to drive home. Something about her tone that day felt different from the manipulative guilt trips of my teenage years. Sharper, more calculated, like a woman running numbers in her head rather than expressing genuine hurt. I didn't understand yet exactly how calculated it really was. That night I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, searching phrases like family contesting a will and financial elder pressure lawsuits, trying to arm myself with information before whatever Delphine planned next arrived at my door, because some deep, exhausted instinct told me this was only the opening move in a much longer fight. The following week unfolded exactly the way that instinct predicted. Preston started messaging me first, gentle-sounding texts about how hard things had been for the family lately, how Delphine cried herself to sleep some nights over how distant we'd all become. Then came a call from an aunt on my father's side I barely knew, asking pointed questions about whether I was really going to let my aunt struggle when I had so much money sitting in the bank. Word had clearly traveled fast through the extended family grapevine, each version of the story growing a little more distorted, painting me as the greedy niece who abandoned her struggling family the second she got rich. Nobody mentioned the part where Delphine put a 16-year-old out on the street with 2 duffel bags and a deadline. I called Roberta Quinn the next morning, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be, and explained everything: the lunch meeting, the $200,000 demand, the vague threat about making things difficult. Roberta listened without interrupting, the way good attorneys do, taking notes I could hear scratching faintly through the phone. When I finished, she told me something that settled a small, hard knot in my chest just slightly. She said Delphine had no legal standing whatsoever to claim any portion of the estate, that a notarized will explicitly excluding her was about as airtight as documents get, and that any lawsuit she filed claiming reimbursement for raising me would almost certainly be dismissed outright, given how briefly that guardianship actually lasted, before ending in abandonment. Roberta recommended I start documenting everything from that point forward. Every call, every message, every uninvited visit. The same advice I'd read online the night before, but hearing it from an actual professional made it feel real instead of paranoid. She said families who feel entitled to money rarely stop after one polite refusal, that pressure campaigns tend to escalate in stages. Guilt first, then anger, then sometimes legal threats that carry no real weight but plenty of intimidation value. I thanked her, hung up, and created a folder on my phone labeled simply Documentation, the same folder I would end up filling with screenshots, recordings, and photographs over the following months, each one a small brick in a wall I was building without fully realizing how tall it would eventually need to be. 3 days later, Delphine showed up unannounced at my workplace, walking straight past the front desk before the receptionist could stop her, demanding loudly to speak with me about an urgent family matter. I heard my name called over the office intercom, my stomach dropping the instant I recognized what was happening. I walked out to the lobby to find her standing near the elevators, dressed sharply, speaking in a tone calibrated to sound reasonable to anyone listening, while every word aimed directly at guilting me in front of my coworkers. She said Grandma Eleanor would be ashamed of how I was treating family, that money had clearly changed me, that surely a quick conversation wasn't too much to ask. I told her, as calmly as I could manage with my pulse pounding in my ears, that this was my workplace, and she needed to leave immediately. She raised her voice slightly, just enough that two colleagues glanced over from their desks, saying I was embarrassing myself by acting like a stranger toward the woman who helped raise me. I reminded her, my own voice shaking now, that she stopped raising me the day she kicked me out at 16, and that showing up at my job wasn't going to change a decision that had nothing to do with her in the first place. My manager, a soft-spoken man named Desmond Okafor who also happened to be a certified financial planner outside of his day job, stepped in at that point, asking Delphine firmly to leave the building or he would call building security. Delphine left, but not before turning back one final time to say, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear, that I would regret choosing money over blood. I stood frozen for a long moment after the elevator doors closed behind her. Humiliation and fear tangled together in my chest in a way that made it hard to breathe evenly. Desmond checked in with me privately afterward, and when I gave him a short, careful version of the situation, he offered something I hadn't expected. He mentioned that beyond his day job managing our department, he did financial consulting on the side, and he suggested I consider setting up formal protections around the inheritance before things escalated any further. Protections that could make the money legally difficult for anyone to touch regardless of what claims they tried to file. I took him up on that offer within the week, sitting across from him in a small consulting office 2 evenings later, laying out every account and asset my grandmother had left me. Desmond walked me through options I'd never heard of before: irrevocable trusts, asset protection structures, beneficiary designations specifically crafted to withstand family disputes and frivolous legal claims. He explained that with the right structure in place, even if Delphine somehow convinced an attorney to file suit, the money itself would sit behind legal walls thick enough to make pursuing it essentially pointless. I signed the paperwork establishing a protective trust 2 weeks after that first meeting, Desmond serving as financial advisor while Roberta reviewed every document for legal soundness, and for the first time since the will reading, I felt something close to solid ground beneath my feet. That fragile sense of stability lasted almost exactly 9 days. My phone rang late on a Sunday night, an unfamiliar number I almost let go to voicemail, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Marcus. No wait, I had to remind myself that name felt wrong somehow, so instead the man said his name was Grady Wentworth, a subcontractor who'd worked with Roland's contracting business for the past several years. He said he was calling because he felt someone in the family should know the truth before things got worse, and my stomach dropped immediately at the seriousness in his tone. He explained that Roland's business wasn't simply struggling, it was drowning, buried under debt from bad investments and missed payments stretching back over a year, and that Delphine had been pulling money from wherever she could find it to keep the whole operation afloat just a little longer. Grady said something else that made my blood run genuinely cold, something I hadn't considered until he said it out loud. He mentioned that Delphine had apparently been managing Grandma Eleanor's finances for a period of nearly 2 years before her stroke, helping with bill payments and account access after Eleanor's eyesight started failing, and that Grady had overheard Roland complaining more than once about withdrawals from an account that didn't belong to either of them. He said he didn't know the full details, only fragments overheard through thin office walls, but he felt uneasy enough to make the call rather than stay silent about it any longer. I thanked him, my hands trembling as I hung up, and immediately called Roberta first thing the next morning. Roberta's tone shifted the moment I relayed what Grady had told me, her usual measured calm replaced by something sharper and more focused. She asked whether Eleanor had given Delphine any formal power of attorney or account access during those 2 years, and I told her I honestly didn't know, that Eleanor had never mentioned it to me directly. Roberta said she would pull whatever financial records were available through the estate process, that if Delphine had been managing Eleanor's accounts and diverting funds without proper authorization, that wasn't just a family dispute anymore. That was potentially elder financial abuse, a category of fraud that carried real criminal weight rather than the empty legal threats Delphine had been throwing around at diners and office lobbies. It took Roberta almost 3 weeks to gather everything, working alongside a forensic accountant named Naomi Fitzgerald, whose actual specialty, it turned out, was uncovering exactly this kind of quiet, slow-bleeding financial abuse hidden inside family finances. Naomi held a background in forensic accounting with a focus on elder exploitation cases, and when she called me to walk through her initial findings, her voice carried the specific, careful gravity of someone who had seen this pattern before and knew exactly how damaging it could be. She said the records showed a pattern of transfers from Eleanor's checking account into an account jointly held by Delphine and Roland, small at first, a few $100s here and there, then growing steadily larger over the final year before Eleanor's stroke, totaling just under $90,000 altogether. I sat on my kitchen floor listening to Naomi read off dates and amounts. feeling something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with the betrayal underneath it. My grandmother had trusted her own daughter to help manage her finances in her final years, the same daughter who'd thrown me out at 16, and then had the nerve to demand a portion of the inheritance those very finances produced. Naomi explained that some of the transfers had memo lines reading things like household expenses or medical costs, but the actual bank statements showed the money moving directly into Roland's failing business accounts, within days of each withdrawal, a pattern too consistent to be coincidence, too deliberate to be anything but exactly what it looked like. Roberta scheduled a call with me and Naomi together to discuss next steps, and I remember gripping my phone so tightly during that conversation that my knuckles ached afterward. Roberta explained that we had two paths forward: a civil claim against Delphine's share of any remaining assets to recover the diverted funds on behalf of the estate, or a formal report to law enforcement given the scale and pattern of the transfers, which crossed clearly into criminal elder abuse territory under state law. She said the choice was mine to make, that she would support whichever direction I felt was right, but she wanted me to understand the weight of both options before deciding. I told her I needed a day to think, and that night I barely slept at all, staring at my ceiling, replaying every guilt trip, every demand, every uninvited visit through this new, horrifying lens. I met with my therapist, Dr. Lena Ashcombe, 2 days later, a session I'd scheduled months earlier for entirely different reasons that suddenly felt insignificant compared to everything unfolding around me. I told her everything: the inheritance, the lunch meeting, Grady's phone call, Naomi's findings, the sick, spinning feeling of discovering my aunt had likely been stealing from her own dying mother while simultaneously demanding money from me. Dr. Ashcombe listened without interrupting, the same patient way she always did, and when I finally stopped talking, she asked me a single question that cut straight through the noise in my head. She asked what Grandma Eleanor would have wanted me to do with the truth now that I had it. I thought about that question for a long time after leaving her office, driving nowhere in particular, just letting the streets pass by while I turned it over in my mind. My grandmother had spent her whole life giving people the benefit of the doubt, teaching for 30 years, forgiving a daughter who barely visited her, opening her home to a scared 16-year-old without a single condition attached. But she'd also written that will with absolute clarity, cutting Delphine out entirely, choosing words carefully enough to make sure everyone understood exactly why. I realized somewhere on that drive that protecting her memory meant more than staying quiet to keep the peace. It meant making sure the truth of what happened to her money, and to me, didn't just disappear into another round of family denial. I called Roberta the next morning and told her I wanted to pursue both paths: a formal report to law enforcement and a civil claim to recover what remained possible for the estate. Roberta connected me with a detective named Priya Okonkwo-Bell, 17 years with the Financial Crimes Unit, who specialized specifically in cases involving exploitation of elderly or vulnerable family members. Detective Okonkwo-Bell met with me in a small interview room that felt far more sterile and serious than Roberta's office ever had, walking me through the process of filing a formal complaint, explaining terms like chain of custody and evidentiary documentation with the patient clarity of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, but still treated every case like it mattered. She reviewed Naomi's forensic report line by line, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates or account numbers, her expression professionally neutral but her pen moving steadily across her notepad the entire time. When she finished, she told me the pattern of transfers, combined with the timing relative to Eleanor's declining health and Roland's business troubles, was strong enough to warrant a full investigation, and that she would be requesting additional bank records under a formal subpoena to trace exactly where every dollar had gone. She said cases like this moved slowly, sometimes taking months to build properly, but that the paper trail Naomi had already assembled gave them a substantial head start. Most investigations didn't get to enjoy this early. While the investigation quietly began working in the background, Delphine's pressure campaign against me somehow intensified rather than easing off. She started calling from unknown numbers after I blocked her original one, leaving voicemails that swung wildly between tearful apologies and sharp, controlled threats about lawyers she claimed to have already hired. Preston showed up at my apartment building one evening, buzzing my unit repeatedly until I finally answered through the intercom and told him firmly to leave, or I would call the police. He said his mother was falling apart, that Roland's business was on the verge of total collapse, that surely I could find it in my heart to help family in crisis regardless of old grudges. I told him the crisis his mother was in had her own name written all over it, and I ended the call before he could respond. 3 weeks into the investigation, Naomi uncovered something even more damning buried inside the financial records. Evidence that Delphine had also attempted to add herself as a co-signer on one of Eleanor's larger investment accounts, roughly 4 months before the stroke, a request the investment firm had apparently flagged and denied due to inconsistencies in the paperwork submitted. Naomi said this attempted addition, combined with the existing pattern of diverted funds, painted a picture of someone actively working toward gaining full control over her mother's assets, not simply mismanaging money during a stressful period the way Delphine's initial explanations to Roberta had tried to frame it. I remember reading that report at my kitchen table, my coffee going cold beside me, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and grief tangled together in my chest. Detective Okonkwo called me on a Thursday afternoon to let me know the district attorney's office had reviewed the case file and agreed there was sufficient evidence to move forward with formal charges against Delphine for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a felony carrying real prison time depending on the total amount proven at trial. She said charges would also likely extend to Roland given the direct benefit his business received from the diverted funds, though his exact level of culpability would depend on further investigation into what he actually knew and when. I sat with that news for a long moment after hanging up, feeling none of the satisfaction I might have expected, only a heavy, exhausted sense that something inevitable had finally been set into motion. The arrest happened on a quiet Friday morning, though I only learned the details secondhand through Roberta, who'd been in contact with the district attorney's office throughout the process. Delphine was taken into custody at her home, Roland brought in separately for questioning the same day, their landscaping and contracting business already teetering financially before the investigation had even become public. Word spread through the extended family almost instantly. The same grapevine that had painted me as greedy and ungrateful, now scrambling to process an entirely different narrative, one where the woman who'd called herself the family matriarch stood accused of stealing from her own dying mother, while simultaneously demanding money from the niece she'd thrown out years earlier. My phone exploded with messages over the following days, cousins and distant relatives suddenly eager to apologize for believing Delphine's version of events without question. My cousin Preston sent a long, rambling text, claiming he'd had no idea about any of it, that he was just as blindsided as everyone else, though something about the timing of his sudden sympathy felt hollow after months of guilt-tripping calls on his mother's behalf. I responded to almost none of it. I'd learned enough over the previous months to understand that forgiveness offered under pressure of public scandal rarely meant much once the scandal faded, and I wasn't interested in performing reconciliation for people who'd shown me exactly who they were when it mattered. Preliminary hearings began about 6 weeks later, and I sat in the back of a courtroom I never imagined I'd need to enter, watching Delphine appear before a judge in clothes far less polished than the outfit she'd worn to Roberta's office months earlier. Her attorney argued for reduced charges, claiming the transfers represented informal family financial arrangements rather than deliberate theft. But Naomi's forensic testimony, delivered with the same calm precision she'd shown me from the very beginning, methodically dismantled that argument piece by piece, using the actual banking records as evidence. I watched Delphine's face throughout the hearing, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw something in her expression that looked genuinely, completely powerless. The case eventually resolved in a plea agreement rather than a full trial, Delphine pleading guilty to a reduced charge of financial exploitation in exchange for restitution and a suspended sentence with probation, given her lack of prior criminal history and the argument that some portion of the funds had gone toward household necessities during a genuine financial crisis. Roland faced lesser charges related to knowingly benefiting from the diverted funds, resulting in a smaller fine and probation of his own. Neither of them went to prison, a fact that frustrated me at first, but Roberta reminded me gently that the restitution order, the felony record, and the public collapse of Delphine's reputation within the family carried consequences that would follow her for the rest of her life, regardless of whether she spent a single night behind bars. The restitution ordered by the court covered a portion of what had been taken from Eleanor's accounts, funds that flowed back into the estate and by extension into the trust Desmond had helped me establish months earlier. I donated a significant portion of that recovered money to a local elder advocacy nonprofit that Naomi had mentioned during one of our calls, an organization that helped investigate and prevent exactly the kind of financial abuse my grandmother had quietly suffered without anyone noticing until it was almost too late. It felt like the only right way to close that particular chapter, turning something stolen from my grandmother into protection for other elderly people who might otherwise go unnoticed the same way she nearly had. Preston reached out one final time about 4 months after the sentencing, asking if we could meet for coffee, saying he wanted to understand what had really happened and maybe start rebuilding some kind of relationship. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity rather than hope, and we sat across from each other at a small cafe while he asked careful, hesitant questions about the investigation and the years leading up to it. He admitted, quietly, that he'd known more than he'd let on about his parents' financial situation, that he'd chosen not to look too closely because it was easier than confronting what he suspected. I told him I appreciated the honesty, but that honesty 6 months late didn't undo 6 years of silence while I was the one paying the price for everyone else's comfort. Delphine sent one letter through her attorney about 5 months after sentencing, an unusually formal document given how personal the situation actually was, apologizing in careful, lawyer-approved language for the financial harm caused, and expressing hope that we might someday reconcile as family. I read it twice, sitting alone in my apartment with Eleanor's old teapot steaming on the counter beside me, and I felt surprisingly little in response to it. Not rage, not forgiveness, just a quiet, settled understanding that whatever relationship Delphine and I might have had died long before that letter arrived. Somewhere between a 16-year-old girl packing 2 duffel bags and a woman calculating exactly how much her own mother's final years were worth in dollars. I moved into Grandma Eleanor's house about 8 months after her death, once the estate finalized completely, and the last of the legal proceedings wound down. I kept her rose bushes alive through that first summer, clumsily at first, learning through trial and error the same patience she'd always shown with everything and everyone in her life. I converted her old sewing room into a small home office where I still do drafting work most evenings, the same steady, quiet job that had somehow anchored me through the strangest year of my life. Desmond still manages my trust portfolio, meeting with me quarterly over coffee to review investments that grow slowly and steadily. Exactly the kind of security Eleanor would have wanted for me, even if she never got to see it fully realized. I still see Dr. Ashcombe twice a month, though our sessions have shifted gradually from crisis management into something closer to ordinary maintenance, processing grief that surfaces unpredictably in quiet moments, like finding Eleanor's handwriting on an old recipe card, or hearing a song that used to play in her kitchen. She told me once that healing doesn't mean the anger disappears completely, it just stops running the show. And I've found that to be almost exactly true. I still feel a flash of something sharp and old whenever Delphine's name comes up in family conversations, but it doesn't consume entire days the way it once threatened to. Back when I was still learning how to stand firm against someone who'd spent years teaching me that my boundaries didn't matter. One year after the will reading, almost to the day, I sat on Eleanor's back porch watching the roses bloom for the second summer since I'd taken over caring for them, and I finally let myself feel something close to peace about the entire ordeal. My grandmother had left me more than a house and a bank account. She'd left me proof that someone in my family had truly seen me clearly, had trusted me enough to protect what she'd built her whole life around, and had known, somehow, exactly what her own daughter was capable of long before the rest of us found out the hard way. Delphine spent years insisting she was the matriarch, the head of the family, the one holding everyone together. But in the end, the only thing she'd actually built was a paper trail that finally told the truth.